Okay, this is round 2 of shimming the fuel release valve on the 6.7 liter Cummins. I say it's round 2 because the first time I got to this point where I had my fuel release valve already removed, it turns out that TS sent me the wrong type of back-off nut to actually screw on there and back it off. As you can tell by looking at the incorrect nut, this is a really coarse thread pitch, and it doesn't match up with this right here. Now, when you try to thread them together, of course, it only goes in about that far and it stops. Now, at this point, if you happen to wind up with this, just put it back together. Either call TS and get the correct nut, they'll send it to you free of charge, or you might be able to go down to your specialty nut house and actually get the correct nut, which, although it has not been confirmed by anybody, I believe that this is a 18mm by 1.5 thread pitch metric nut. It's not exactly readily available at your average Home Depot, Lowe's, Osh, or any one of those places, but any specialty nut house should have it. Now, of course, with the way things go, I haven't actually heard of anybody else on any of the forums having a problem with the incorrect nut, so I seem to be one of the very few who's had this issue, and the truck doesn't run very well without this part in here, and it makes it really hard to get the truck out of the driveway to go down to the store and get the correct nut. So, something to check for and be aware of before you begin the process of actually digging out the fuel release. Okay, the theory on what we're doing here is, in order to shim the fuel release, we need to remove this part right here from this back piece. Now, I don't know all of the official names of these parts, I'm just kind of going off of this piece and that piece. It's important to notice, too, on the fuel rail valve, there are these little indentations that actually hold this piece in. Now, the purpose of the nut, which I've been referring to as the back-off nut on a lot of the forums, is you screw it down to the end here, being careful of the rubber washer. It doesn't have to go the whole way down. You don't have to really get on it and tighten it in there, and I really wouldn't do that because my nut isn't really finished very well on a couple of sides, and it's a little bit sharp there. We don't want to tear up that little O-ring that's on the end of it, but it just has to go on far enough to where this end is sticking out. And we're going to put this end into a vise and turn the nut until it pulls this part away from this part right here. And inside there we're going to find the spring, and we're going to find a little plate with some holes in it and a little tiny pin that we got to be really careful we don't lose. Now, also worth mentioning is that if you have access to a 3-jaw chuck or even a collet setup like on a lathe, I would use that as opposed to just a regular flat jaw vise like what I have here, which is from a Chinese drill press. It's not exactly the best, but I'm going to try to closely duplicate the way the instructions have us do it, and we'll see what we get from that. Okay, so here's the setup in the vise. One of the things I noticed is that as we're trying to turn this nut and pull this apart, that the back part of it likes to turn. And if the back part of it's turning, you're basically just spinning the whole assembly around. You're not actually getting any tension to pull this off. So what I've had to do is put a 18mm wrench on the back of it right here on this side. Let's see, you're trying to work around a tripod. I normally don't video most of what I'm doing in my shop. Let's see, okay, like that. And I have a crescent wrench right here for actually getting on the nut and turning it. We're actually going to be turning the nut in the direction that we would take it back off of the fuel release. And I'm told there's some spring tension behind here, so I'm keeping my finger behind it, because we don't want things flying off and wanging across the shop, particularly not my shop, because there's a very slight chance we're actually going to find anything in here. Okay, it looks like I can get the rest of it with my hand here. I'm blocking the camera a little bit. Not really much to see here anyway. Okay, so now it's all loosened up. Let's see what we have here on the inside. Alright, there's our little spring right there. And we're actually going to be pulling this out, and the shims are going to go in behind it, right down in that little hole. And I'm going to stop the camera for a second here and try to get a look inside the end of the cap here and see what's inside there. Okay, so here we are looking at the disassembled fuel release valve, kind of in the order that it came apart and where everything goes. Down here are the shims that are supplied by TS for the purposes of shimming the fuel release. I'm told that they are number 4 stainless steel washers. The most important part, and the part people seem to have the biggest problem with, is this little tiny pin right here. Try to get it up a little bit closer to the camera. It actually sits down inside here, inside the hole. This is the back side that would, face this direction. And without this pin, the engine doesn't run or doesn't run very well, and it's quite easy to lose it, and it's quite easy to just have it fall out, and it's very difficult to find it once you have lost it, particularly if you're kind of a slop hog like me. Now, it's a little hard to see on the camera here, but this actually is directional. It has a pointed end and a flat end on it. The pointed end goes back down inside the fuel release cap here, pointed toward the direction of the rail, so kind of like that. The next piece we have is this washer with the 3 holes in it, which sits in right here. And then we have the spring part, which the spring part kind of goes on it, like, well, it's not going to stay there, but the spring part actually goes down inside here. And then on the standard unit, it all fits together like that. Now, what we're going to be doing is putting these shims in, if I can pick them up, in behind the spring, and this is to change the pressure at which this fuel release valve actually releases. And the spring goes in on top of that, and there we have it. All we have to do now is put it back in our vise, put it back together, and re-crimp the little indentations that were shown earlier on the sides. Okay, one thing to note here is that if you take yours apart and this piece does not fall out, then there's a really good chance that your pin also hasn't fallen out. The pin actually can't fall out unless this comes out first. So if it doesn't fall out, you shouldn't have to worry too much about the pin. Now on mine, it was actually held together very well because there was a lot of fuel down inside there, and it had kind of a suction effect, and it was just keeping everything in there nice. Okay, so here we are at shimming the fuel release valve on the 6.7 liter Cummins. Just because I'm curious about such things, I decided to go ahead and measure the thickness of all these shims put together. And it's coming out to about 90 thousandths of an inch total for all 3 of these little washers. And actually a little bit less, but we'll call it 90. So now we take the shims and we take our fuel release valve. The shims go down inside like so. We take our spring like so. And we want to make sure that if our little plate here with the holes in it has actually come off the back of the cap, that the pin is still down inside the cap. You don't want to put this all back together again with this little pin right there. It's kind of hard to see on the camera here, but you want to put it all back together with that missing. So we want to make sure that's in there, and we put this back on top. Okay, the next part of the reassembly process is putting the cap back on the plug here. And we pointed out these indentations right here along the side of the cap earlier when we disassembled the plug. And if you look right here on the side, we have a recessed area where those indentations go in there and actually hold this part in. TS recommends that we put some cardboard on one side of our vise, and I just cut the side of their box off and just shoved it in there. Also important to keep in mind is with the shims underneath here, this spring tension is a little bit higher than it was when we took it apart. So it's going to be pushing out a little bit more, and we want to make sure that we crimp these well, and also keep your finger over it when we pull it out so that it doesn't go flying off across the shop. Okay, so here is the whole thing ready for reassembly. Now with the shims behind it, I can't really press this back in there with my fingers, so I'm going to have to kind of get it in the vise somehow. This is the end. It should be facing out, so if you have the other end facing out, it's incorrect and it won't run. Get this in the vise with one of the indentations or the little crimps, the little areas we have to pound, facing up so I can get to it with my little punch. It's going to take a little bit of tension to get this thing in here. Okay, and it flattens out right there. I can't turn the vise much further, and you don't really have to hammer down on the vise to get it in there. You just kind of get it in there so it's seated. going to take my little center punch here and my little hammer, just tap the indentations back down. Rotate it. You want to do this 3 times. Push it on there. Tap it down. Turn it for the last one. And tap this one down too. And that's it. That's Shimming the fuel release valve for the MP8 installation on a 6.7 liter Cummins.